Great, so first, as I said, we need to generate user's client key and certificate signing request, which is very easy to do using an OpenSSL tool that you already learned in one of the previous lectures. So let's go ahead and do that. OpenSSL command should already be available on your server, so we don't have to install it. And a subcommand for OpenSSL is gen RSA, because we're generating an RSA key. And the name of the file that will contain the key will be devtom.key, and we specify that as out or output option. And finally, we're going to specify that we want a 2048-bit RSA key. That's it. That will create the client key for devtom user. And if I ls here, this is the key. And we can also check the contents of this file. There you go. This is simply an RSA private key file. So that once done, as a next step, we're going to create a certificate signing request for the key that we just generated. Again, open SSL request, because we're creating a new request. And the input for that request is going to be our key, because we want the key to be signed, basically. And again, we need to save that request into an output file. And we're going to call that devtom.csr, certificate signing request. And there's one more thing that we are going to do here, which is adding a subject or setting a subject inside the certificate that will be then generated, where we set the certificate name to be Tom. And this basically will indicate that the certificate is for user Tom. And this is going to be the name which Kubernetes will use when validating the request using this client key and certificate. So we're just going to call it Tom. And that's the command. This will actually give us devtom.csr file right here. Again, let's check how it looks. And there you go. You see certificate request and the contents here. So we have those two files here. Now, as a next step, we need to send this certificate signing request to Kubernetes itself, so that Kubernetes can sign it for us using the certificate authority of Kubernetes. And we do that, again, by creating components in Kubernetes in a Kubernetes native way, as you already know, using configuration files. So I'm going to go to Kubernetes documentation and search for certificate signing request. And here we have an example of how a certificate signing request resource in Kubernetes will look like. So I'm simply going to copy this example. So I'll take the YAML part from here, and we're going to create a file called devtom.csr.yaml. And let's paste the contents. So again, certificate signing request, that's a Kubernetes object coming from this API group with this version, and a couple of attributes here in the specification. First, let's change the name. Let's call it devtom. And the main part in the specification is the request itself. So what is this value? You can also check that in documentation, actually. The request value that we set here is base64 encoded value of the CSR file that we generated. And you also see an example of how to get that value from the CSR file. So let's copy that. I'm going to save this changes, and we need the base64 encoded value of the CSR file contents. So the command that I copied, of course, we have to adjust the name like this. So what we're doing is we are printing out the contents of devtom.csr file. Then we are base64 encoding those contents by piping it to base64 program. And then we're removing all the new lines because we want the contents in one line, basically. We don't need new lines. So we're trimming all the new lines. So let's execute. So that's the value, the base64 encoded value of this file. So back to our Kubernetes configuration file, dev tom csr.yaml. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the existing value to a new line, and then I'm going to just delete it by clicking D twice and paste in the new value. And there you go. And note that this is one string basically without any new lines here, which is exactly what we need. The signer name will stay the same. Usages will stay the same. This is a client certificate, and we can actually extend the expiration date to longer than 1 day. So this will be around 100 days. So basically we set an expiration date on the certificate and we renew it regularly before it gets expired. And I'm gonna save this, and we have our certificate signing request configuration for Kubernetes. And just like any other Kubernetes configuration file, we need to apply it using kubectl apply command. So dev tom csr yaml. And when we apply the file, we actually get this error that says that expiration seconds attribute or field is unknown. And the reason for that is because that field was actually added in the latest Kubernetes version 1.22, and we have installed Kubernetes version 1.21. So that's why it's not supported. What we can do is basically just comment out or simply remove the field and maybe use it when we upgrade the cluster version. So I'm gonna save the changes and let's try to apply again. And there you go. So by creating this CSR or certificate signing request resource in Kubernetes, we basically sent the Kubernetes certificate API a request to sign our dev tom user's certificate. So let's see the state. kubectl get CSR will actually list us all the signing requests that are in the cluster and their conditions, which this one is in a pending state. And we as Kubernetes administrators also have to have the ability to approve this. So that's the name of the requester, which is Kubernetes admin user. That's the user we are connecting to the cluster right now and executing the kubectl commands. And the user is basically defined in kubeconfig file that our kubectl command is using. So I'm going to do grep Kubernetes admin, and let's print out 2 lines or so, and there you go. In the kubeconfig file, we have the user, which is Kubernetes admin, and that's the user we are executing those kubectl commands with. So that's the requester, and we as an admin also have the permission to approve any certificate signing requests. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to approve this request. And for that, there is a subcommand called kubectl certificate. We can also see the help information on that. And this command is used to modify any certificate resources in the cluster. And we have approve or deny commands for approving or denying CSRs. So kubectl certificate approve, and we need the name of the CSR, which is dev tom approve. And now let's check again. We should have CSR in an approved and issued state. And this means we actually just got our CSR signed by Kubernetes CA, and that signed certificate is what we need for dev tom user to connect to the cluster. So we're going to extract that information using kubectl get CSR dev tom and then printing it out in a YAML format. So we're getting the details of this CSR, and as you see here, we have a bunch of attributes like the request that we set, signer name, etc., and a new field in the status called certificate. So as you know, status section is automatically generated by Kubernetes, and this section was basically automatically added with all these values, and one of them is the signed certificate for our user, which is again base64 encoded, so we would have to decode it to see the actual certificate. So I'm going to copy that, and since we have devtom.key, which is the private key, we can also create devtom.crt certificate, which is going to be the public key of that pair. And that's very easy to do. We're going to basically echo the base64 encoded contents of the certificate. Then we're going to decode it like this. Let's see that first of all. And as you see, we get an actual certificate. And we could actually save this into a file called devtom.crt. Let's clear this ls, and that's our file. Let's check the contents, and there you go. So now we have a key pair for our user, which is private key and public key with the certificate, which is signed by Kubernetes certificate authority.